The sun had just begun to dip behind the row of towering oak trees lining the suburban street. The evening air was warm, carrying the faint smell of freshly mowed lawns and the soft rustling of leaves. For most of the residents of Meadowbrook Heights, it was a time of peace, a quiet, orderly existence defined by meticulously manicured lawns, neutral-colored houses, and a strict adherence to the rules of the HOA. But for one resident, today was different. Today, they had decided to make their home their own. It had started as a simple idea. The protagonist had spent months envisioning a beautiful backyard retreat, a sanctuary that would stand out in the neighborhood, one that would reflect their personality. The deck, old and worn from years of neglect, was the perfect canvas. They had a vision in mind. A rich, deep teal that would contrast beautifully against the light beige of the house. It wasn't garish or excessive, just a touch of individuality in a world of beige. With a sigh of anticipation, the protagonists dipped their brush into the bucket of paint and began to work. Each stroke was like a burst of energy, each color bringing them closer to the vision they had nurtured in their mind. The rhythmic swish of the brush against the wood was calming, a far cry from the anxiety that had been building up over the past few weeks. But as the paint began to cover the weathered surface of the deck, a growing sense of unease crept in. The neighborhood, once so peaceful and predictable, now felt almost too quiet. The distant hum of air conditioners and the occasional bark of a dog felt like the only sounds breaking the stillness. Yet despite the serenity of the scene, something felt wrong. The protagonist's hands trembled slightly with each brushstroke, though they couldn't pinpoint why. Then, a shadow fell across the deck, blocking the warm rays of the sun. They paused, brush in midair, and looked up. Standing at the edge of the yard, just beyond the neatly trimmed hedges, was Karen, the HOA president. She was watching them. Karen was everything the protagonist had learned to avoid. An overbearing, self-righteous figure who prided herself on keeping the neighborhood pristine. By her definition, she had earned her reputation over the years as the neighborhood enforcer, the one who issued complaints for the slightest infraction. A hedge trimmed just a bit too tall, a flagpole slightly askew, a front door painted in the wrong shade of blue. The list of offenses was endless, and she had made it her personal mission to police every last one. For a moment, the protagonist considered ignoring her. Surely she would go away. But no. Karen took a step forward. Her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Her eyes narrowed in disapproval. The silence stretched on, suffocating. Then, her voice, cold and sharp, broke the tension. "You can't do that," she said, her tone icy, almost predatory. The words hit harder than expected. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat, and they lowered the brush, glancing at the deck as if it were a child being scolded. "Excuse me," they managed, trying to keep their voice steady, though they could feel the knot of unease tightening in their stomach. "That deck," Karen continued, her gaze sweeping over the bright color like it was a personal affront. "It violates the HOA guidelines. You can't just go painting it whatever color you want. You'll have to repaint it." Her eyes gleamed with authority, like she knew this was only the beginning. But what did she mean by repaint? What lengths was she willing to go to? The words hung in the air like an unspoken challenge. The protagonist didn't know it yet, but this simple decision to paint their deck would set off a chain of events that would unravel the carefully constructed facade of this perfect neighborhood. This was no longer about color or design. It was about control. And the storm was just beginning to brew. The next morning, the protagonist stood by the window, staring out at the freshly painted deck. The teal color seemed to glow in the early light, a bold statement against the subdued landscape of the neighborhood. They felt a surge of pride. This was their home, their sanctuary, and they had every right to express themselves. But as they admired the work, a nagging thought lingered in the back of their mind. Karen, the protagonist, had known this day was coming. It was too perfect, too peaceful, and in the world of Meadowbrook Heights, nothing stayed perfect for long. Sure enough, just as they had suspected, a letter arrived from the HOA. They unfolded the crisp, official-looking paper, and their eyes immediately zeroed in on the bold, menacing font that read, "Violation of Community Standards." "Dear homeowner," the letter began, as if it were a polite greeting. "It has come to our attention that the color of your deck does not comply with the HOA guidelines. This is a violation of Rule 14. Subsection B. Exterior color palette. You are required to repaint your deck to a neutral shade within the next 7 days, or you will face fines and legal consequences." The words blurred together as the protagonist's pulse quickened. The familiar cold dread that had first gripped them the day before returned, tightening their chest. They had heard stories about Karen's strict enforcement of the rules, but this felt personal. Karen had seen the deck, and now she was going to make them pay. The letter went on to outline the fines, and the more they read, the clearer it became. This wasn't just about a deck. This was about power. Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules. She thrived on control, on ensuring that every single homeowner bowed to her vision of perfection. The protagonist had dared to challenge that vision, and now the battle lines were drawn. They folded the letter slowly, the weight of it sinking in. The fine print was almost a blur. They knew what they had to do. But would it be enough to defy Karen? Or had they just sparked a firestorm they couldn't escape? Determined not to back down, the protagonist made the decision to confront Karen directly. The HOA's rules were clear, yes, but the deck wasn't breaking any laws, just her idea of taste. They had every right to stand their ground. Yet, as they marched toward the front door, a growing unease wrapped around them like a heavy cloak. Karen wasn't just any neighbor. She was the HOA president, and if there was one thing she wasn't willing to do, it was lose control. The moment the protagonist stepped outside, they spotted her, standing by the mailbox, glaring at the deck. The sight sent a shiver down their spine. Karen didn't move. She simply stood there, like a sentinel guarding the line between right and wrong. And she had every intention of making sure the protagonist crossed it. Well, Karen's voice sliced through the air. There was no greeting, no attempt at small talk, just cold, biting authority. "I see you've decided to ignore the rules. Again." The protagonist's stomach churned. They could feel their heartbeat in their throat. "Karen," they said, trying to keep their voice even, "I'm not repainting it. I've read the guidelines, and I'm within my rights. This is my property." A wicked smile curled on Karen's lips, one that sent a chill through the protagonist. "Oh, you think so?" she asked, her tone like honey laced with venom. "You haven't heard the last of this. Trust me, the board won't let this slide. You'll regret it." And with that, Karen turned, walking away with that same chilling smile on her face. It was a smile that said she was playing a game she always won. The protagonist stood frozen in place, the unsettling realization creeping in. Karen wasn't just a stickler for rules. She was a woman on a mission, and that mission would destroy anyone who dared to stand in her way. The deck, the brush, the color, it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was survival. And in this neighborhood, survival meant one thing: winning against Karen. The silence that followed was deafening. But it wasn't peace. It was the calm before the storm. And the protagonist had no idea just how fierce the storm would be. The next morning, as the protagonist sat at the kitchen table, the weight of Karen's threat hung heavily in the air. The silence in the house seemed unnatural, as though the world outside had held its breath in anticipation. The deck, still vibrant in its bold teal hue, now looked more like a battleground. The brushstrokes of pride felt like an act of defiance, and in the cruel game Karen had started, the protagonist knew they were about to face the consequences. The sound of footsteps on the gravel outside snapped them from their thoughts. It was a sound that could only mean one thing: the HOA enforcer was here. Karen stood at the foot of the driveway, arms crossed, her gaze fixed on the deck. Her posture was stiff, her lips pressed into a tight line. There was no mistaking it. She had come to deliver her ultimatum, to remind the protagonist of who was in control. Taking a deep breath, the protagonist walked out the front door, determination in every step. They could feel the weight of her eyes on them as they approached, the air between them thick with tension. The sun blazed down on the street, but all the protagonist could feel was the chill of impending confrontation. "Karen," they greeted, keeping their voice steady, though inside, their heart was racing. Without acknowledging the greeting, Karen tilted her head, her gaze fixed on the deck, with that all-too-familiar disdain. "I gave you a chance to make things right," she said, her voice smooth but laced with a chilling finality. "But I see you've chosen to ignore the rules, just like I knew you would." The words hit harder than expected. It was as if Karen saw herself as some kind of judge, someone whose opinion was above all else. The protagonist's fingers clenched at their sides, the desire to fight back bubbling just beneath the surface. But they knew it wasn't just about the paint anymore. It was about power. "I've read the rules, Karen," the protagonist said, trying to hold their ground. "And nowhere does it say I can't paint my deck any color I want. This is my property, and I'm within my rights." Karen's lips curled into a tight, almost predatory smile. It was the kind of smile that made the protagonist's stomach churn, like a snake preparing to strike. "Your rights," she repeated, her tone dripping with sarcasm. "That's adorable. But you forget, this neighborhood isn't just about your personal taste. It's about maintaining the integrity of the community. And when you break the rules, there are consequences." The protagonist's breath hitched. What consequences? What lengths would Karen go to in order to correct this? The silence stretched between them, broken only by the distant chirp of birds and the faint rustling of leaves. In that moment, the tension felt suffocating. Karen took a step forward, her eyes narrowing as she studied the protagonist. "You've made this personal now," she said, her voice low and dangerous. "And I don't take kindly to people who challenge my authority. If you think this will just blow over, you're sorely mistaken. The HOA board will make sure of that." The protagonists stood frozen, the anger rising in their chest. They wanted to shout, to argue back, but something about Karen's presence, her calm, calculated threat, made them hesitate. They were on unfamiliar ground now. They didn't just have to worry about repainting the deck. They had to worry about their entire place in this neighborhood, their reputation, and their future under the rule of the HOA. "You'll regret this," Karen said softly, almost too quietly to hear, as she turned on her heel to leave. "You've made a mistake you'll never be able to undo." As she walked away, the protagonist felt a shiver run down their spine. What did she mean by that? Was she just blowing smoke, or was there something more sinister in her words? But there was no time to dwell on it. Karen was already out of sight, retreating to her fortress of power. The protagonist stood in the driveway for a moment longer, heart hammering in their chest. One thing was clear, this wasn't just about paint. This was a war, and they had just stepped into the battlefield. The days following the confrontation with Karen were heavy with the tension of an impending storm. The protagonist went about their daily life, but the quiet streets of Meadowbrook Heights now seemed oppressive. Each creak of the floorboards, each rustle of leaves, each neighbor's glance felt like they were under scrutiny. The letter from the HOA was still in the back of their mind, and Karen's threat echoed in their thoughts, a constant reminder that things had shifted. But it wasn't just Karen who seemed to be watching. The neighborhood itself felt different, as though the ground beneath them had shifted, and the weight of something unseen was closing in. At first, it seemed like the typical suburban quiet, neighbors mowing their lawns, the sound of children playing in the street, the occasional car pulling into a driveway. But when the protagonist ventured outside to check the mailbox one afternoon, a chilling realization hit. The mailbox was full, not of junk mail or advertisements, but official-looking envelopes. One after another, the names of familiar neighbors were etched on the return addresses, HOA violation notices. Each envelope carried the same cold, corporate tone. failure to comply with neighborhood standards. It was clear now. Karen wasn't just angry. She was orchestrating a campaign. And the target was anyone who dared to step out of line. As the protagonist sifted through the pile, it became increasingly apparent that Karen had used her position not just to enforce the HOA rules, but to control the lives of everyone in the neighborhood. She had planted seeds of fear and compliance in every corner of Meadowbrook Heights. The protagonist felt a cold knot twist in their stomach. Karen's influence was deeper than they had imagined. The once quiet HOA meetings had become clandestine gatherings of like-minded individuals, all working together to keep the neighborhood in check. It wasn't just about the deck. It was about control. And now, the protagonist was caught in the web. Trying to make sense of the situation, the protagonist decided to reach out to a few neighbors, hoping for some insight. But each conversation was a dead end. Faces that had once been friendly were now guarded. Eyes darted away when their gaze lingered too long. A sense of dread hung over the interactions, as though a secret was being kept just beyond reach. It wasn't until the protagonist spoke to Janet, a longtime resident, that they began to piece the puzzle together. Janet had always been one of those quiet, well-mannered neighbors who kept to herself, never one to rock the boat. But there was something different about her now, something wary in her eyes, like a person who had seen too much. "I know what you're going through," Janet said, lowering her voice as if she were sharing a dark secret. "Karen, she's not just about keeping the place nice. She's been running this neighborhood for years, making money off fines and threats. She targets people she thinks are weak or who don't fit her perfect mold. If you step out of line, she makes your life hell." The words hit like a punch to the gut. Karen wasn't just some overbearing neighbor. She was a manipulator, a puppet master pulling strings behind the scenes, and the protagonist had become her next target. But Janet's warning didn't end there. You've probably already seen the others. The ones who've moved away or suddenly sold their houses. They didn't leave voluntarily. They were forced out. If you want to survive, you need to be careful. Trust no one. The hairs on the back of the protagonist's neck stood on end. Karen's wed wasn't just about rules. It was about driving people out, controlling everything around her, and making sure no one dared to question her authority. The protagonist could no longer ignore the danger that loomed larger than just an ugly deck. But now that they knew the truth, what would they do with it? How could they fight back against someone who had so many under her thumb? The realization hit with a sickening clarity. They couldn't back down. Not now. The protagonist had entered Karen's world, and there would be no turning back. The stakes had grown higher, and the game had become far more dangerous than they had ever imagined. And somewhere, deep inside, a fire was beginning to ignite. This was no longer just about a deck. This was war. The days seemed to drag on, each one blending into the next like a haze of uncertainty and fear. The protagonist couldn't shake the feeling that the walls were closing in. Every shadow in the neighborhood felt like an observer, every rustle of leaves like a whisper of secrets being exchanged behind closed doors. Karen's reach stretched further than they had ever imagined. The air was thick with the pressure of something looming just beyond their vision, waiting to strike. But the protagonist wasn't backing down. They couldn't. Not after everything they had learned. Not after what Karen had done to so many others. With the HOA's violation notice hanging over them like a dark cloud, the protagonist knew they had only one option: to fight back. But how? Karen's control was seemingly all-encompassing. The more they thought about it, the more impossible it seemed. It wasn't just about repainting the deck anymore. It was about exposing Karen for what she truly was: a manipulator and a tyrant, exploiting the neighborhood for her own gain. But could they even hope to defeat her? It was time to gather allies. The protagonist had spent so long isolated in their own fight that they hadn't noticed the quiet rebellion simmering beneath the surface of Meadowbrook Heights. People whispered about Karen's tactics, how she forced families out of their homes, how she manipulated every rule and every fine to tighten her grip on the neighborhood. The walls had ears, and those who had once been too scared to speak up were now beginning to stir. There was power in numbers, and the protagonist knew it was time to make their move. They reached out to a few neighbors, people who had been quietly resisting Karen's rule. There was Thomas, a single father who had spent years dodging Karen's notices for having a garden that was too wild. Then there was Linda, an elderly woman who had lived in the neighborhood for decades, watching as Karen slowly chipped away at the freedom they'd all once had. And finally, there was Emily, a young professional who had recently moved into the neighborhood, blissfully unaware of the dark undercurrents until the first fine arrived on her doorstep. The first meeting was cautious. They'd met in the protagonist's house, the curtains drawn tight to keep the prying eyes of Karen's spies at bay. The air was thick with tension, each person aware that any wrong move could make them the next target. But there was something else in the room, something that hadn't been there before. Hope. "We can't keep living like this," Thomas said, his voice low but filled with determination. "Karen has us all under her thumb. It's time we fight back. Together." Linda nodded, her face set with resolve. "I've seen it before. She has a way of making people feel small, but we can't let her do this anymore. Not to us. Not to you." Emily, her eyes wide with disbelief, finally spoke up. "I didn't think it was this bad. I just thought it was the HOA doing its job, but hearing all this, it's more than that, isn't it?" "It's about control," the protagonist said, their voice steady but simmering with anger. "And she's made us all believe that we don't have a choice, that we have to follow her rules. But we don't. We can fight back. We just need to make sure we do it the right way." The group sat in silence for a moment, the weight of their words sinking in. They were no longer just a few disgruntled neighbors. They were a team. And together, they had the power to bring Karen's empire crashing down. But there was one piece of the puzzle they hadn't figured out yet. How? How could they expose Karen's manipulation without drawing her ire too soon? How could they play the game without being caught in her trap? The answer came slowly, like a whisper in the dark. "We start small," the protagonist said, their voice firm with resolve. "We start by finding out just how deep Karen's influence really goes. We collect evidence. We make sure we know every rule she's broken, every illegal fine she's issued, every secret she's kept hidden." Thomas looked skeptical. "And then what? How do we bring it to light?" The protagonist's eyes gleamed with a dangerous light. "We play her game, and we play it better." But just as they began to feel a flicker of hope, a shadow fell across the room. A knock at the door. A soft, deliberate knock that sent a chill down their spine. Karen. Their hearts raced as they shared a look of panic. Had they been discovered? Had she found out about their plan? The knock came again, louder this time. And with it, the realization that the battle was about to escalate. The protagonist's heart skipped a beat as the knock echoed through the house, louder this time, more deliberate. Every muscle in their body tensed, every nerve firing in alarm. The group huddled together in a tight circle, the air suddenly thick with the weight of impending danger. Karen was on the doorstep. There was no mistaking it. The knock came again, urgent, demanding. "Who is it?" The protagonist's voice cracked, betraying the anxiety racing through their veins. No one spoke for a moment. The silence was deafening. Then, almost instinctively, the group scattered, moving like shadows to hide behind furniture and in corners. It was a reflex, an instinctive response to the ever-watchful eyes of Karen. The protagonist glanced through the peephole, dreading what they might see. Sure enough, there she was, Karen, standing on the doorstep with her signature smug smile, arms folded, as though she were waiting for a confrontation. The protagonist swallowed hard, heart pounding in their chest. They needed to act quickly, but what could they do? They couldn't just let her waltz in, not when their plans were at the tipping point, not when the pieces were starting to fall into place. But what if Karen already knew? What if she had been watching them the entire time, every whisper and every secret conversation. The idea of Karen knowing their every move sent a fresh wave of panic crashing over them. The knock came again, this time followed by Karen's voice. "I know you're in there," she said, her tone smooth, almost too calm. "Open up, or I'll make this much worse for you." The words felt like a slap in the face, but the protagonist wasn't about to let fear dictate their actions. They stepped back from the door, taking a deep breath to steady their nerves. They could not afford to panic. "Not now. Give me a minute," the protagonist called out, their voice betraying a hint of unease, but not enough for Karen to notice. They moved swiftly, glancing around the room to make sure everything was in order. The evidence they had gathered, photos, documents, and screenshots of Karen's violations, was tucked safely away in a drawer, but that wasn't enough. They needed a plan. They needed something to fight back with. They signaled to the others, who crept silently into the hallway, peering out from behind corners with nervous eyes. The tension in the house was palpable, the energy crackling with the threat of Karen's wrath. The protagonist turned toward the door, making a snap decision. They would not let Karen walk away with the upper hand this time. Taking a deep breath, they opened the door just enough to speak through the crack, but not enough for Karen to get a glimpse inside. "What do you want, Karen?" the protagonist asked, their voice hard, though their insides were a roiling mess of uncertainty. Karen's smile stretched wider, but there was something different about it, something colder, more calculating. She knew, just by the way the protagonist had opened the door, that they were hiding something, and she wasn't about to let it slide. "I think you know what I'm here for," Karen replied, her voice dripping with smug satisfaction. "You've been causing problems in this neighborhood, and I'm here to put an end to it. Now, I'm willing to overlook this little stunt with the deck, but not if you make me force your hand." The words hung in the air, sharp and heavy. Karen wasn't just threatening a fine anymore. She was threatening to destroy everything. The protagonist took a slow breath, steadying themselves. They couldn't let Karen win. Not after everything they had been through. Not after all the work they had put into gathering evidence. This wasn't just about the deck anymore. It was about exposing the truth, about showing the neighborhood that they didn't have to live under Karen's thumb. "I'm not afraid of you, Karen," the protagonist said, forcing the words out with as much strength as they could muster. For a moment, there was silence. Karen's eyes narrowed, and a flash of anger flickered across her face. Then, just as quickly, the anger was replaced by that icy smile. "I don't need you to be afraid of me," Karen said softly, her voice now full of quiet menace. "I only need you to know that I always get what I want." And with that, she turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply against the pavement, each step a reminder that she was still in control. The protagonist watched her retreating figure, their stomach churning. This wasn't over. It was just beginning. As Karen disappeared from sight, the protagonist turned back to the group, their heart racing. "We have to move quickly," they said, determination burning in their eyes. "We can't wait any longer." The game was on, and this time, they weren't going to lose. The days after Karen's visit were a blur of planning and tension. The protagonist and their small band of allies met in secret, working tirelessly to gather more evidence, document Karen's abuses, and lay the groundwork for their next move. The weight of their decision pressed down on them, but they knew one thing for sure. There was no turning back now. Each new revelation they uncovered about Karen's manipulation fueled the fire of their resolve. The complaints, the fines, the sudden home sales, they all pointed to one horrifying truth. Karen had built a web of fear and control that had ensnared every corner of Meadowbrook Heights, but the protagonist and their team were no longer content to be pawns in her game. They were ready to expose her for what she truly was. It was during one of these late-night strategy sessions that Thomas brought a breakthrough, a copy of the HOA board's meeting minutes, which had been carefully redacted to hide certain decisions. But Thomas, ever the tech-savvy thinker, had managed to bypass the redactions. And what he found was a revelation. Karen had been funneling HOA fines and fees into personal accounts, using the neighborhood's rules as a means to line her pockets. It was worse than they had imagined. "Look at this," Thomas said, passing a printed sheet to the group. The numbers were damning. Karen's fingerprints were all over the financial discrepancies. The evidence was irrefutable. "This is it," the protagonist said, their voice steady but filled with a simmering anger. "This is how we take her down. We expose her to everyone." But just as hope began to rise in the group, the reality of their situation hit. They were up against someone powerful, someone with influence, and a network that stretched beyond the neighborhood. Karen had the ear of many of the other residents, and though the group had their evidence, they still had to find a way to bring it into the light without being silenced first. Then, just as they were formulating a plan, disaster struck. The phone call came in the dead of night, its sudden ring piercing the silence like a knife. The protagonists jumped, their heart pounding as they fumbled for the phone. It was a private number. "Hello," the protagonist answered, their voice tight with suspicion. "Don't think you can hide forever." Karen's voice sneered from the other end, smooth as ever, but laced with a venomous edge. "I know what you're doing. You think I didn't see your little meeting last night. You think you can just expose me and walk away unscathed." The protagonist's stomach dropped. She knew. She had been watching. Every move they made, every conversation they had been monitored, every secret uncovered before it even had a chance to breathe. "I don't know what you're talking about," the protagonist said, forcing their voice to sound calm despite the storm brewing in their chest. "Oh, I think you do," Karen replied, her tone dripping with satisfaction. "You're in over your head. And just so you know, I have more influence than you'll ever understand. Keep pushing, and I promise you, you'll regret it." The line went dead with a click. The protagonists stared at the phone, still gripped in their trembling hand. It was a warning. And it was clear now that Karen wasn't just the neighborhood's tyrant. She was willing to destroy anyone who threatened her power. The group reconvened immediately, the air thick with fear and urgency. The stakes had just been raised. Karen wasn't just trying to control the neighborhood anymore. She was threatening their lives, their futures. "We can't back down," the protagonist said, their voice fierce with determination. "This isn't just about exposing her anymore. It's about protecting ourselves. If we want to survive this, we have to take her down now. And we have to do it smart." But just as they began to form a plan, another chilling thought hit the protagonist. What if Karen had allies outside of the neighborhood? What if she had already begun plotting her next move? The group felt the gravity of the situation bearing down on them. The clock was ticking, and with every passing hour, Karen's grip on the neighborhood grew tighter. The protagonist could feel the walls closing in, their every move under scrutiny, every second drawing them closer to a dangerous confrontation. The point of no return had passed. There was no going back. They were all in. And somewhere in the distance, Karen was watching, waiting for them to make their next move. The morning sun cast long shadows across the quiet streets of Meadowbrook Heights, but the atmosphere in the protagonist's house was anything but peaceful. The weight of everything they had been working toward pressed down on their shoulders like a 1,000-pound boulder. The group had gathered one final time, their faces drawn with exhaustion and fear, but also with determination. "We can't waste any more time," the protagonist said, their voice calm, yet unwavering. "We've done everything we can to gather the evidence. We have her financial records, the minutes from the HOA meetings, the witness accounts, everything. Now we just need to make our move. It's time to take down Karen." The group nodded, their resolve hardening. There was no more room for hesitation. This was their last shot, and they had to get it right. But as they planned their final steps, one thought gnawed at the back of the protagonist's mind. Karen wasn't just a force in the neighborhood. She had connections, power that extended far beyond the gates of Meadowbrook Heights. Every moment they spent planning felt like they were walking a razor-thin edge between victory and disaster. "Are we sure this is going to work?" Emily asked, her voice filled with uncertainty. Karen's powerful. What if she has something else up her sleeve? What if we're just playing into her hands? The protagonist turned to her, their expression hardening. We've come too far to stop now. We know what she's done. The people in this neighborhood deserve to know the truth. If we don't act now, nothing will change. Not just for us, but for everyone she's hurt. Thomas, ever the skeptic, let out a deep breath. But we need leverage. We need her to slip up. If we just confront her outright, she'll have us arrested or worse. The room fell silent as the weight of the situation settled over them. They all knew that confronting Karen was a dangerous game. She had been controlling things for so long. Could they really expose her without bringing her wrath down upon them? We have one shot at this, the protagonist said, looking around the room. Karen can't afford to have her secrets exposed. We'll use that against her. A plan began to form, a risky, dangerous plan that could either expose Karen for good or send them straight into her clutches. The protagonist knew there was no turning back now. The final play was set in motion. The group split up to put the plan into action. The protagonist and Thomas would attend the next HOA meeting, where they would present the damning evidence of Karen's financial misconduct. Linda would quietly distribute copies of the documents to other residents, ensuring the word spread fast. Emily would serve as their backup, documenting everything in case things went wrong. The meeting was scheduled for that evening. As the hours ticked by, the tension in the protagonist's chest only grew. Karen was going to be there. It would be the perfect setting for her to launch a counterattack if she knew what was coming. The protagonist could feel the knot in their stomach tightening as they prepared to face her. When the evening arrived, they'd made their way to the community center, the gathering point for the HOA meeting. The building was eerily quiet, save for the low murmur of neighbors who had gathered, gossiping and waiting for the meeting to start. The protagonist's pulse quickened as Karen walked in, her icy smile still in place, her confident stride belying the storm brewing beneath her calm exterior. This was it, the moment everything would change. The meeting began, and Karen launched into her usual spiel about neighborhood rules, her voice smooth and authoritative. The protagonist could feel their hands tremble slightly, but they forced themselves to stay calm. Now was not the time for fear. When it was their turn to speak, the protagonist stood, facing the room full of expectant eyes. They could see Karen sitting at the front, her gaze fixed on them, the unmistakable glint of threat in her eyes. The protagonist took a deep breath, letting the silence hang in the air for just a moment longer before speaking. "I'm here tonight to bring something to light," they said, their voice steady but firm, "something that has been hidden for far too long." They handed the evidence over to the HOA board, making sure it was clear to everyone in the room. Karen had been manipulating the neighborhood rules for personal gain. The records, the bank transactions, the violation fines, all of it was laid bare. The room went silent as the weight of the evidence sank in. Karen's face twisted in fury. Her mask of control shattered, revealing the monster beneath. "You think you can just," she began, her voice trembling with rage. But before she could finish her sentence, the local authorities, who had been tipped off by one of the neighbors, walked in. It was over. Karen's reign was coming to an end. As Karen was handcuffed and led out of the meeting, the room erupted into stunned murmurs. The protagonist stood there, watching as her empire crumbled before their eyes. For the first time in what felt like forever, the weight lifted from their shoulders. Karen's power, her threats, her control, they were no longer the things that defined Meadowbrook Heights. It was over. And as the neighbors exchanged glances, some filled with disbelief, others with a quiet sense of triumph, the protagonist realized that this was only the beginning. The neighborhood had been freed, and they had been the ones to make it happen. The final twist of the knife had come, and Karen was no longer in control.